The firstborn of Chaos had the simplest demand: blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. Earlier this week, I picked up the box of the Accursed Cultist, and it's a literal treasure trove of Chaos mutations. I just had to make a Chaos Space Marine. And when making a Space Marine, you might as well make him into a massive Terminator. I prepped my Space Marine by removing all of the Imperial insignia and sending it down to a nice smooth surface. And I wanted to start with a leg. Despite the fact that whenever I try to do something with a leg, it goes terribly wrong, I had a good feeling about this. The primary reason I chose this specific pose for the Terminator is that it matched the closest to the leg. Every single attempt I've made so far to kitbash a leg always resulted in an incorrect posture due to the mismatch of the leg. This time, I tried to choose the closest counterpart I could possibly get. And after the painstaking process of about 30 minutes off camera, it was actually really close. This demonic head was an absolute perfection as it screamed Khorne, and it also reminded me a little bit of the Balrog, which really helped to match the theme of a fallen angel for the Space Marine. Rather than attaching all of the parts one by one, I made sure to save it for later. Now, a demon of Khorne would not care about his armor, especially taking care of it, so I want to give him quite a bit of battle damage of just really deep impacts for where bolt rounds bounced off, and a few marks from where somebody foolish enough decided to get into the close range with this demon, but they were not strong enough to actually take care of him. As bolt rounds explode on contact, I made sure to grab the X-Acto knife and accentuate all of the holes. And this Space Marine was finally ready to receive all of his crazy mutations. Most demons find it quite tough to stay in the material world, especially when they're far from the warp, and they have to use special vessels like Space Marines that are powerful enough to contain them. And the more powerful the vessel, the more powerful the demon can be. What if the Space Marine is actually consuming an additional vessel to contain the more powerful demon? And this piece being the catalyst, I decided that it'd be quite interesting to have the literal second person growing from the armor. But first, we need to pay some bills. Now let's dive into the world of strategy, resource management, and historically inspired city building. In the sponsor of today's video, Forge of Empires. It's a game about expanding your city and evolving through the ages, starting from the Stone Age going all the way into the Space Age. You also have the option to build your own army and conquer different lands, unlocking different resources. Additionally, you can join to create your own guild, which is, I would say, a vital part of the game, as you gain access to a ton of cool features, for example, the guild expeditions and quantum incursions. Being a part of a guild, you can actually help each other level up, and they can use their forge points and just help you with your buildings in general. For example, my guild helped to level up my grade building all the way to level 10 and allowed me to upgrade a ton of things. So make sure you check out Forge of Empires, and for all the new players, there's a link in the description. By clicking it, you'll gain access to 25 forge points, 1,000 coins, and 1,000 supplies. And if you reach the Bronze Age, you unlock the Welcome event with 150 raffle tickets and as well as the 2 golden dice, helping you level the trading outpost. It's free and it's available on both a browser as well as your mobile phones. And thanks for watching that, but for now, let's get back to the horrific mutations. It's a relatively small bit, but it really matched the idea of this fallen angel where these horrific mutations are just growing of the armor. With most of the horrific Chaos Space Marines mutations, most of the time, even though their armor looks like armor, it is actually a part of them, with grotesque mutations growing literally from it. And as I mentioned before, the idea of this fallen angel Balrog really resonated. The half-grown wing is almost a symbolism to the fact that the demon never ascended to the true rank of a bloodthirster. Now for the catalyst piece of this entire idea, I really wanted to showcase that it's growing a part of the arm. I closely matched the shoulder socket of the mutation with the elbow joint of the Space Marine. Whenever the Space Marine is moving his arm, this grotesque mutation moves along with him. A grotesque reminder that the vessel absorbed never has any control and is simply stuck attached to him. I thought about removing the additional melee claw that was growing from it, but I thought it provided a lot of extra utility and the additional mutation just matched the theme. The position of the mutation also made it look like the hand is also literally on the trigger, part of this horrifically bloodthirsty machine, screaming for eternity but never being able to do anything. Usually the Space Marine and the Possessed battle for the control of the body. The strongest of the Space Marines get to control the demon inside of them and gain tremendous power. In case of my Space Marine, I thought the bloodthirst of the Space Marine matched so closely to the demon that they merged together to the point that they're inseparable in goal. The mortal soul inside is gone. All that remains is thirst for power, thirst for blood, and rage. Lots of rage. Now to attach the leg and the head, I will need to use some green stuff. Having finally learned a bit more about it, I left the green stuff just for a little bit so that it solidified. allowing me to have a much easier time in placing the leg and not have it just wibble around. This meant that sculpting it would be a bit more challenging, however, I was not concerned with that. The shape of the leg is relatively simple, and I would just have to match the shape of the muscle. Once the general shape of the muscle was decent enough, I used my sculpting tool to smooth out the surface. Initially, I thought about creating a very distinct connection point for where the leg goes, however, I thought that creating the idea that it goes inside of the armor would be a lot easier to achieve. Additionally, removing the idea that there's some semblance of a space marine inside of it is just more of this horrific demon. I had a bit of temporary white stuff holding the neck together, and I actually almost entirely forgot about it to the point that when I got to the green stuff, it was already quite stiff. But it was still good enough that I managed to sculpt a really decent connection to the neck, and I was quite satisfied with it. The top of the miniature felt just a little bit empty, so I found this really cool piece that was a perfect match. The special number of Khorne is 8, and this star had 8 points, and inside of it had 8 tiny little teeth. It was perfection. Now some honorable mentions of the parts that did not make this bash. For quite a while I contemplated going for a melee weapon or alternatively having a massive twin-link cannon. But I settled on a simple bolter to not distract from all of the other mutations. The other alternatives I considered were having a lot more grotesque mutations, however, it did not match the idea of Khorne. Additionally, on my previous Space Marine Terminator, a lot of the people complained that there was not a tail, so I finally found the perfect match for it. And the Chaos Lord in Terminator armor has a slightly lifted base, so I used a bit of cork to match that. And on the base, I decided to include a boxwalker that is essentially waist deep in mud, stuck and unable to move. And this Khorne demon is walking by and just casually execute him. Not out of pity, but just to collect an additional skull. Usually to harden up the cork, I prefer to use a bit of super glue, but it tends to generate a horrendous amount of fumes, so I thought I'd try to use some texture paint instead. Which also gave quite a rocky texture to the rest of the cork surface. Now, out of every single Space Marine Legion, one stands out as the favorite of Khorne, the World Eaters. I really didn't want to go for the red armor because it would just be clashing with the red skin. Pre-Horus Heresy, World Eaters actually had an entirely different color scheme. Instead of being red, they were white with blue shoulder pads. And I thought the idea of this color scheme with just a red demon sticking out of it would look phenomenal. However, as painting pure white is a bit of a nightmare, I thought I'd go for a little bit of a cheat. While painting my enormous Genestealer Dreadnought, I found it quite surprising how easy it was to paint such a massive miniature in a near white color. By simply avoiding the pure white and going for a very bright gray, I was able to achieve a very similar effect without any of the problems that you usually face when painting pure white. For the skin of the Khorne demon, I essentially used a bit of contrast paint to cover up the surface, and I thought initially about separating the additional vessel inside. However, I thought that creating the idea that there's absolutely no separate identity for it would match it much closer. This way I'm also hoping it'll look a lot more like all of those mutations are part of the Space Marine rather than Space Marine wearing some grotesque things similar to what a Slaneshi Space Marine might do. I mixed a dark brown color that I used up to cover the base, and then additionally began using the exact same color to fill in all of my dent marks. Instead of a pure black, this should hopefully read as just a collection of dirt that has gathered inside of those areas. Perhaps it's even a type of oxidation that is just naturally occurring inside of it. Then I moved on to painting the shoulders that made me think quite a lot about the original color scheme of the World Eaters. They had this color scheme before they implanted the butcher's nails that provided them with so much rage. And while by no means would you call a Space Marine calm and tranquil, the color scheme did represent that in some sort of way. The white and blue armor to me just looks a lot more calm and collected, representing the original identity of the Space Marine when he had all of the different emotions and capable of thought. But just like the armor on the outside, the horrific bloodthirsty demon has always been inside of him. And like a sealed container, it finally burst, releasing all of the rage, seeping out from every single layer of the armor and finally releasing the bloodthirsty demon. When painting the shoulders, I really enjoyed the texture of my Sorcerer and Terminator armor, so I closely matched that, which looked quite a bit like an ocean of previous tranquility that is now corrupted by the bloodthirst. Before I moved on to the skin, I varnished the miniature to get rid of a lot of the gloss that the contrast paint had. I previously tried painting just over the contrast paint normally, however what tends to happen is it's very difficult to gauge what the true color of the skin is because of all the gloss, and as you're applying the matte paint, it makes it very difficult. I've had quite a few different brands of paints that once you varnish them, they tend to shift their colors quite drastically. So after a while, I slowly began to realize what specific brands had this effect, so I usually varnish them before moving on with the rest of the steps so that I know what colors I'm dealing with. Once I was done with the skin, I did make sure to provide a lot of the details on the teeth and the eyes. It's a relatively small thing that I think adds a massive amount of detail and just personalization to the miniature. To match this bloodthirsty demon, I knew of the perfect weapon. The molten steel is quite an interesting effect that I've previously attempted, but I never finished all the way through, giving up quite early on. So I thought I'd actually commit to this effect and give it a go. Now, as if through the void of space, Games Workshop heard the fact that I was working on Khorne and thought, we should give him some rage. So I remembered why I hate these paint pots so much. And well, after spilling this paint pot, I also remembered why this paint is so powerful. And let me tell you, I was really happy the fact that I had my painting mat on top of the table because this stuff is an absolute nightmare to clean up. The yellow contrast paint has a very powerful staining effect that I found quite difficult to clean up even from the painting mat using strong alcohol. And after finishing the stippling effect on the sword, I moved on to quite the most challenging but also the most interesting part of this effect. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is technically the carbonization of the metal that is occurring from the molten effect. For this effect, I ended up using the exact same brown that I used for my base. In the previous attempts that I would give up, I usually get to this process using pure black and realize that the effect looked absolutely horrendous. But this simple shift in color made quite a bit of a difference. Even though it was my first time painting the sword and it went horribly wrong throughout the entire process, in the end I think it actually turned out pretty decent. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this, and let's see the final result. And don't forget to check out Forge of Empires and click the link below to try out the game.